Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. There is a lot of similarities when you really pick it apart between George Seurat, the pointillist painter, and Stephen Sondheim, the concise composer. Trying some alliteration here at the beginning. How's it working for you? I do have a fun guest here today. Culp is joining me to talk about the similarities between the two men and what that says about the art that they're producing. So I might as well get right into it. Here's my conversation with Culp. Culp, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
I'm very excited. Whenever anyone says that they have brought notes with them, it gets me very excited because it makes my job so much easier.
Oh, yeah. I've got some chapters, some books, a very infamous article if we get there.
Well, let's start to kind of more generally here. First and foremost, I'm assuming because you've done so much work analyzing musical theater here in the past, what got you into musical theater in the first place?
I enjoyed musicals as a youth, but I started getting into musicals more and more out of philosophy. So I studied philosophy, and philosophy of music was always something that was interesting. And then I just got hung up on the research question, what breaks when you break into song?
Oh, interesting. Wait a second. Where does that question come from?
I mean, some of it, I haven't really heard anybody else really kind of put it that way. My kind of foundations have always been around kind of German idealism because it's all metaphysics with Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. So it's like, how do you get into the musical world? Like with Schopenhauer, it's like going behind the veil because then the musical world is the will of the world. And so what breaks to get us there? And how do we get back? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a very dangerous journey. Like, as evidenced by Orpheus, but also all the TV musical episodes where people sing and dance and then die. So
this might be taking us down a huge diversion. That is an interesting question in as far as that I think that a lot of musical theater fans don't really question it all that much, and is what non-musical theater people usually say is what they bounce off of the most. It's like, I can't stand it when people break out into song, right? It breaks my immersion into this story. Whereas musical fans are like, no, like that's what brings me in. Like and making me enter into that world. So it's interesting to pose that philosophical question of like, what is breaking? Because for a lot of people, it's their immersion into the story, right? They can't go on that musical journey with that person.
Exactly. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I really love teaching about musicals, but also because it's that hang up for people, but also it's a huge issue for the composer, for the writer, the director of how to handle it, because it can be mismanaged. I see that, to knowing that full well that I can go on a tangent, but I see that in this musical as well, in terms of how does Sondheim try to do that? Way that doesn't, let's bring it out of visual art. How do we do that? How do we break into song about a painting?
I mean, Sondheim has written about this in his own books and has spoken about it publicly, about at least in his philosophy of writing music and lyrics, is that there has to be a good reason of why this person is entering into a song versus it just staying as a book scene. And sometimes even playing around with that being half book scene, half sung through. So what is being stated, what is being sung, why is this being stated versus being sung? So he takes a lot of pains to be very clear, at least for himself, and explain this is why, for me, I'm doing it this way. And whether or not I guess the audience reacts to that or not is up to the audience.
I think that's evident with Sondheim and other folks. It's more complicated sometimes because what he'll do is he'll have those scenes, and then some people will be like, well, it doesn't sound like a full song, or because it is part book, or but I also really love things like artless singing or artless statements. So those things that are in a musical number that aren't sung, but they're, with Sondheim, they're rhythmically placed. They have the rhyme scheme that reflects everything. It's still all audially goes together.
Just to hopefully to explain to people who might not be up on their philosophy, might not be up on the giants of philosophy, and I'll put myself in that bucket too, because I know the names of, I think you said Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, I know those names. I don't know if I could really get into any detail about who they are what they stand for. So I don't need a biography, but is there a way that you can like maybe just sum up this is what their ideas were about and why it relates to what we're talking about here today?
So my real slap and dash would be Nietzsche is influenced by Schopenhauer, who is influenced by Kant. What happens is that Nietzsche takes Schopenhauer's idea of music being kind of the underlying truth of the world. And it's not that the music that we listen to is, but that music itself, like absolute music is. What I like to go to is The Birth of Tragedy, which is one of his first books, and then The Case of Wagner, which is one of his last books. And it describes basically this idea of Apollonian and Dionysian forces. The Apollonian being that of order, that of lyrics, that of words, and the Dionysian being that of like spirit and drunkenness and music, which destroys. So order and destruction together back and forth. And in both, he ends up calling for some sort of balance because the drunkenness, the intoxication gets you to the truth. But we can't withstand that because we'll lose our sense of individuality and die. So because we need to be an individual subject to know the truth as a person. So that would be my guy. Like, you know, his music is very important because it's part of this way of getting to create your sense of self in relationship to truth, but it is also one of the most dangerous things. He is in love with Wagner in the first book and considers Wagner a necessary poison in the last book. So all that's also tied with Wagner stuff going on. But so it's that idea that there's something about music that because it's outside of what we see, it's because it's outside of the logic, the rational, all those things that, that time period in Europe, people thought music didn't do, that it escaped that. It was more truthful and it was reality rather than the world that we have it as an ordered reality in front of us.
So this is, again, as a complete novice walking into this conversation, it seems like you were saying that from their perspective, they're two opposites, lyrics and music. Was the argument that lyrics were bringing order to chaos of music, or not really at all?
Yeah, that would be the way. So the lyrics would be, and to a certain extent, lyrics being maybe somewhat too orderly sometimes, but that lyric,
okay.
Apollo is associated with the lyre. And so the ability to play the lyre and sing at the same time, as opposed to like a wind instrument or whatnot, which would be more of the Dionysian.
So sorry, lyre as in Lyre, right? The instrument you're playing.
Lyre.
Okay, gotcha.
Whereas Dionysus is more like the satyrs playing the flute, the panpipes. But it's that balance. A lot of people read it like that you're supposed to lean into Dionysus. I think that he's telling people during that time that they're not connected to Dionysus as much as Apollo. But if he was around today, it might be a different story.
If he was around today, do you think he would be more of a Sondheim fan or a Pasek and Paul fan? Where do you think he would fall in that?
I've always thought that Sondheim, if I explain my theory of musical theater to Nietzsche, I think he would like it, as he would appreciate the break back and forth, that there's going to be the book time, that you have the straight play, and then you have the musical, and that those things go back and forth, as opposed to opera, which may be too much Dionysus. It may be too overwhelming.
That's a good call out. I think we get so, again, people who are a fan of musicals think they've been around for so long, but really they haven't been. It's like barely 100 years, you could probably argue, that musical theater as a genre has been around. So yeah, these philosophers back in the day, there would have been no reference for this. Opera was the thing.
Especially for Nietzsche. And Wagner's entire thing was that everything had to be one huge experience and that it was overwhelming and all this stuff. And so when Nietzsche decides that Wagner is a poison, albeit a necessary one, he decides that, well, at least he says that his favorite opera is Carmen, because it's very like broken down to popular songs and dances, and you can tell where the numbers begin and end, and it's much more orderly but still passionate.
Okay. Yeah, he would totally have loved Cats. Hi, everyone. on, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help this show continue to go. Now, if you'd like to help support the show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That is greatly appreciated, of course. Putting Together is an independent production. So if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge shout out to the God That's Good tier from Patreon. Once again, you can go to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. The God That's Good tier is Jack, Todd, Robert, Luis, Christopher, Stephen, and Derek. All right, let's get back to the show. Okay, so philosophy brings you into this idea of, I guess, analyzing musical theater and approaching it from that angle. But like, what gets you into Sondheim?
I was thinking about this, and I think my first Sondheim was Into the Woods. I really gravitated towards it because it was a lot going on, and then the Act 1 to Act 2 comparison, and after that, it was getting into all of his other stuff. My favorite being Assassins, which is somebody's, I mean, that's my favorite musical of all time. And when I say that to people, they're like, oh, interesting.
And then they slowly back away. What was the reason that spoke to you?
Assassins, if I had to tell a narrative of American musical theater, so much of what makes a musical theater in the United States in particular is the retelling and reification of the American dream. So like Oklahoma, going back Showboat, but like we have all these big musicals that really say this is what being an American is, quote unquote, and who is not an American, quote unquote, like outside of that. You get to Assassins and it's everybody who, well, not everybody, of course, but it's a group of people who feel outside of what it means to be an American, but told through each time period music and just the wittiness, like Zangara's number where it's two John Philip Sousa marches, and the second one is El Capitan, which is John Philip Sousa like most propaganda operetta he ever wrote. So the fact that the spectators are singing to the most propaganda, like big,
sure.
But so that like it's interesting music history wise, it's interesting lyric wise, it's interesting because it's telling the American dream in a new light and problematizes it. Every number ends with like, you can work your way to the head of the line to shoot a president, but you can work your way to the head of the line.
When we were, emailing back and forth, there's a few different ideas that you had, but I thought the one that would be much more fascinating to discuss is like this comparison between Seurat, the artist, and how he uses pointillism versus Sondheim as an artist, using what you define as modernism. Let's start with Seurat first, and I understand we're not here to do a biography of the man, but he is known as one of the forefathers of pointillism. Maybe you can break down a little bit more what that means, what that is, why that was such a big thing.
So, and I'll admit that my background is music, not visual. So if I get stuff wrong, you can correct me, or anybody can correct me online. My understanding and working through this is that pointillism, and then in doing this research, hearing about it as chromoluminarianism or chromoluminarianism, which I was, that's why chromolum, that's how that ties it. Great. I figured that out new.
Yes.
Is based on the science of perception of how colors react to a person's eyes or a person's sight, in terms of that they'll see a color, but then if it's in a certain sort of distance, complementary colors will start to manifest around it. And so if you have small bits of color, there's the almost optical illusion of other colors showing up. In developing pointillism, and the people that really loved it and advocated for it, it was a scientifically based method of painting. It was like we're painting something that is real because it's based on science, and it was this little dots, little points of color that would then activate something in the viewer rather than be exactly what is on the easel, on the canvas. So I think that's also a thing that to me starts linking it to modernism is that what you have on the canvas is there, but it's actually in the relationship to the viewer that the art then becomes more activated. Because if you don't have a viewer, you don't have the optical illusion of what's going on with the point, the color.
Right. It's really like like the visual representation of that philosophical question: if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? If you paint a painting and no one sees it, did you actually make a painting? Like that's basically what it all is. This musical breaks it down too, but like it is color and light, right? You need the light to reflect off of the dots you're making so that they show color. It's kind of them both combined. I understand why Sondheim would be so fascinated by this idea. He's often described as someone who's more analytical when it comes to songwriting, but also just knowing that in his personal life, he just loved making puzzles and putting things together. I could see why he would be so attracted to that idea of like, oh, if you put these two colors together and stand far enough away, it looks like there's green, even though green is not in this painting in that area.
This is where I'll turn to one of my articles. There's a book out called Sondheim in Our Time and His, and by W. Anthony Shepard. Have you gotten to come across it?
It is on my reading list because past and future guest Ashley Pribble is actually one of the people that wrote a chapter in that book.
And shout out to Ashley, amazing person. So in that book, and where I have these connections, there's a chapter on Sunday in the Park by Laura E. Hause. And sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, because I also am not a French speaker. But it talks about not only Sondheim's relationship to Sunday, but Sondheim's relationship to pointillism through Milton Babbitt, who was always somebody that I thought to be a really interesting influence in Sondheim.
Yeah, so to break that down, that is not a Charles Dickens character. That is a real person that existed and was a professor that Sondheim learned under. Am I remembering that right?
So Milton Babbitt was a very prominent kind of analytic contemporary composer, and that Sondheim went out of his way to go take lessons from him because he also felt like Babbitt, or not, maybe did not even felt like, but knew that Babbitt was kind of like somebody who had tried musical theater and not succeeded very well, but not because I don't think Sondheim thought that his attempts were bad. It was just Babbitt had very different skill sets, more in kind of the mathematical realm of music and stuff that people might listen to and be like, it looks like you threw a cat on a piano, which, I like that, but not everybody's taste. But in this chapter in particular, it's all about how Sondheim is attracted to these aspects of pointillism and just things like order, in that points being these points on a map versus, how many colors there are versus how many notes there are in a scale. And so then you get this kind of like almost numerology where you have the 12 notes in the scale and then these 12 comes up so much. And so he gets this, this author claims that he partially gets this from Babbitt, which makes sense because Babbitt is one of these people that is organizing everything, where the 12 notes of the scale don't operate like normal Western European classical music, where there's a specific order and function. Instead, they can go in whatever order they want, and there's mathematical relationships and ideas behind what happens. I'm curious, in the chapter, Sondheim even considered having, for the color and light, when George is singing all the different color names, having specific pitches associated with each color.
Right.
And then he realized that was maybe a little bit too limiting to his project.
I think he did. I don't know how far he got with that idea. I don't remember now, but I think he wrote about how it just came across as way too discordant for like a Broadway audience probably to embrace. So yeah, he kind of abandoned that idea, but an interesting idea nonetheless. So I guess to bring it back to that chapter, like what does she come to? What does she I guess reveal or discover through her examination of that?
A lot of it is really getting into the nitty gritty of, and it's something that if you're reading it, might have to have some sort of musical theory background and contemporary classical European music theory. But the idea that Sondheim is not just writing songs. And I think that this is something that a lot of people want to discredit musical theater from having art to it. Art as like this idea of a high class notion has its problems as well. But knowing, being able to try to articulate to like a more kind of like traditional music history, music theory audience that Sondheim is actually doing interesting things musically. I think that's part of the goal. And then the other part is, I think the author's main question really is, how does Babbitt influence and reflect this pointillism approach in understanding how the whole show is organized? There's Act 1 and Act 2, and you've got kind of two disparate worlds. But then specifically, Sondheim wanted to learn from Babbitt how to make things whole. So especially Babbitt, if you break apart the function of a scale, the function of the pitches, then you just have 12 A, B, C, D, all these pitches, and they don't make sense. So you have to be able to figure out how to make it a whole. For Sondheim, and for this chapter, I think the author is going, okay, Sondheim learns how to make things a whole and really demonstrates this in Sunday in the Park with George, not only by like having numbers in each act reflect one another, both musically and topic-wise, but also, the culmination of a middle-aged George in the 80s singing to his supposed great-great-grandmother Dot in a love song about moving on. How do you make a show like this work? Well, Sondheim actually does a really big technique of that everything actually links together, and it's not as disparate as people think it.
Yeah, you're kind of breaking my brain here, because I can't believe that I've gone through an entire half of this season talking about pointillism, understanding how that works as a painting technique, but then not putting it together for myself that Sondheim is kind of doing that with Act 1 and Act 2. So him and Lapine are intentionally being like, hey, these next to each other create this new thing. I think that the question I keep asking to people, whether you need Act 2 or not, in my opinion, of course you do, but it's specifically because the Act 1 and Act 2 together, side by side, create something different. It's you need them both to be there, or else it doesn't work. Just like pointillism. So I don't know. That's an interesting concept that they're dramaturgically looking at that idea of pointillism and then constructing a show around that too.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of explaining it, because you need both. I have seen that people talk about not doing Act 2, and I don't know if I'm not going to be the be all end all. This is what Sunday in the Park with George is, but something that comes out of it.
Yeah.
Something that you have to put them side by side. And it has to be together to get a different experience. And Sondheim's intending you, or what Sondheim and Lapine are intending you to get out of it. But it also, it goes down to so many of the intricacies of the music as well. The amount of one syllable words around, make all those dots and those points, and just the amount of puns around dots. Another one that I've always found of interest is that at Act 2, Mandy Patinkin didn't realize the notes were the same. And she was like, it may sound completely different, but you're actually in the same space.
That's so funny. Now, you also mentioned looking at Sondheim as a modernist, in comparison towards a classicist or a postmodernist. I remember doing this during my English studies at university and really delving into the differences between modernism and postmodernism, or if you want to be hip, you can call it POMO, but I don't know how many people do that anymore. That being said, maybe we can break that down a little bit. What does it mean to be a modernist in this context?
I will say my understanding is that modernism gets somewhat different lenses depending on what art form you're looking at it from. So for music, and a lot of movements in music tend to be a little bit later than the rest of the art worlds. My understanding, my breakdown of modernism, it tends to be an obsession with the new, which fits very well with the show, and with the idea of not being satisfied with normal or traditional perception. So musical modernism starts to take hold in saying, hey, maybe we don't follow the same music theory rules we've been following for a bunch of years. We do that, then we actually are changing the way people hear music, because they have expectations and we're undermining them, or we're training them not to have expectations anymore. And so that's where you get things like atonality and 12-tone technique. Again, some of those things people will describe as throwing a cat on a piano. But the idea is then that the artwork itself is giving you the world it's supposed to be perceived in, which I see that as relating to like visual arts, where you get things like pointillism, where it's giving you what the tools you need to get out of it, but you can't like stand right in front of the pointillism painting. You have to have a perspective. You have to think about where you are. And, that these topics come up throughout art history, but modernism, it really kicks in the high gear of like, we need to do something. And some of it becomes also this reflection of the oncoming and then dealing with the Industrial Revolution. Like, okay, now we're becoming more automated. Now we're becoming more ordered. How do we break that? What are the things that break that? And so that modernism also becomes a movement to get out of that somehow, or find the ways to break free, so to speak. And freedom is the thing that pops up a lot. How to break free. And then, in that, it also then becomes the thing that people turn to try to get out of the trauma of the world wars. Because it's like, oh, well, everything that we've been doing has led us here. We must do something else to get out of it. German Romanticism, right, Wagner, some people will say, led us to Hitler. We need to do something other than Wagner to get out of it.
We've gone this far, and I have not asked this question to you yet, which is, what are your feelings towards Sunday in the Park with George?
I find it a really fascinating show. I think, to me, I relate to it more intellectually than some of his other works. But I mean, there's certainly very moving parts to it. And I mean, not because this is the name of the podcast, but the number putting it together, I could listen to that on repeat all the time. Some sort of like underlying anxiety that's still very contemporary about that number. And it's all these voices, but still so orderly. But all the voices, speaking of reflection, it's a little bit of a reflection of Hot Up Here, where everybody's complaining, and then everybody's complaining about a new artwork that they're not in anymore. But it's a really fascinating show. I got to see it about a year ago with a mix of Broadway and local folks in Buffalo, but they did the original orchestration. Oh, nice. So that I was super excited. And then it was, they put it together in, I think, 3 days.
Oh my God. Okay.
This is probably Sondheim is difficult. This is one of the more difficult ones, I would say.
Who do you remember who it was that was starring in it?
I do not. I'm terrible with that.
Yeah, okay. That's a crazy approach to do it that way.
Yeah, they had like many of the minor characters were Buffalo locals who were fantastic, and then this company, it's called Starring Buffalo. They'll bring in 2 or 3 Broadway folks to sing like the major roles. And so it's an opportunity for them, but it's also an opportunity for collaboration. But yeah, they don't have a lot of time. Fly in, practice for 3 days, and put the show on. It's a state reading, not a full show.
Oh, okay. So that makes it a little bit easier. What is the theater scene like in Buffalo?
Buffalo has a pretty big art scene. I think in terms of like Rust Belt US cities, it has that sort of mix of a lot of stuff going on. It used to be, and still tends to be, really huge with contemporary music, different from a lot of places. And then theater, I'm always surprised by how many theater companies there are, and they're not doing insignificant work, and they're doing them quite well. Like I saw Floyd Collins for the first time in like, a storefront that was converted into a theater. Right. And that is also not an easy show. And lots of different, so there's Shays, which is our big theater, which, gets the Broadway tours. But then there used to be a small theater where they would do like the 2-3 person intimate thing. So, going along the darker line, it's where I also saw the musical Thrill Me, which is about the 2 young men who wanted to have the perfect murder in Chicago and kill the young boy. And very interesting. And the composer was one of the actors, and it's just 2 people on stage and a piano.
Wow. Okay.
But we had that, and that I don't think it's around too much. So pretty interesting.
It's a place that I have driven past, or I guess have traveled past, but I've never actually gone into the actual city itself. Growing up in Canada, I do know you have a hockey team, so that's about that's about it. Let's combine these 2 threads here then. So how do we, draw that line between what George Seurat was doing with pointillism and what Sondheim is doing musically, at least in this show, if not more broadly throughout his entire career?
So what I come to, and I think this sort of comes out of Look, I Made a Hat, that Sondheim talks about that he's not normally known as a warm person.
Right.
And to me, some of this is that even if you're intellectual, even if you have these very like puzzle-based almost songs and numbers that Sondheim likes to do, and not all of his stuff is, but a lot, to me, a lot of Sunday is, very structured in a lot of ways, that the warmth comes from its exposure to other things, like color and light. The staging I'm familiar with is the original one because it's on YouTube, but having George and Dot in two different parts of the stage, their numbers go very well together, or their parts go to, because they're both artists, they're both doing these things, but then the warmth of their relationship comes out of that. That they're not getting along communication wise and all that stuff, but you also know that they get along really well because they're both really focused on these very specific things about color and light. It's only in seeing them together, but not like singing to each other, that you're like, okay, this warmth, you feel their love come out of that versus them declaring their love to each other. And the number ends with them like having a fight. But to me, I'm like, oh, but that's a number that displays their love.
It's so true. It's that dichotomy that goes through it, the entire show.
So Milton Babbitt, being this figurehead in my thoughts with Sondheim with this, has an article that, whether or not the history gets a little hazy, but it was published with the title, "Who Cares If You Listen?" And it was about the idea that I'm writing music that is intellectually stimulating as an experiment in sound and important. And I don't know if I need to care if you listen or not as an audience. Now, he's not as hardline as he is with that, but the title makes it infamous because then it's like, contemporary musicians or contemporary composers don't care if we like their music or listen to their music.
Right.
Now, obviously, like, that's not going to be true for a lot of folks, but I think it is getting to that balance and that issue that Sondheim's dealing with in his writing, but also George is dealing with, the various Georges, of, do I make something that people like, or do I make something that I think is true?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also like if we say right now in the year 2023, I think whatever artistry you're in, music, visual arts, movie making, novel writing, whatever it happens to be, there is that struggle sometimes of like, do I make what I know is going to sell so I can make a living at this? Or do I kind of like struggle at this for a while and make the stuff that really does speak to me, but may never, at least in my lifetime, mean anything or like provide me with a stable income sort of thing? This is now getting into a conversation about the ethics of capitalism, but still, I think there's always been that idea, right? It's like, do you just stick to what you love and just, keep going at it? Or just like, I can bend a little bit, make something that is maybe broadly popular and maybe eventually get back to doing the stuff that I actually want to do.
And, I think that goes in in that direction. We could go that way. I think also considering, and I think Sondheim is very aware of this, that musical theater is such a commercial enterprise already. It's a little bit more commercial than a lot of other arts because it's so based on that. Especially, I mean, if you want to do Broadway, you have to have that viability.
Yeah.
Which brings up all of its problems around that. But I think it's also maybe I will put it onto him. It's one of mine and other people I know. If you're writing, you're singing, you're composing, at what point do you bend to try to get other people to understand? And so like George is not willing to bend, and that is, an artistic merit that we, especially like romanticism, the idea that the artist knows what's true when they stick to their guns and suffer for it. With Sondheim is a collaborator. Sondheim is going to bend on purpose. And for really great reason. I think that pulls those things a little bit, but it's also it's capitalism, but it's also the struggle of what's the language I speak where other people can understand me, but I'm true to myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another term that is often used, like you want to bend but not to break. You know what I mean? It's like you don't want to go completely against what your own impulses are for, I don't know, the total of the piece. It's like, okay, I can sacrifice this, or like we're going to get rid of this scene, or like this song that I think is really great is going to get cut because it services what we're trying to do here, but I'm not going to go so far afield. And I mean, Sondheim mentions this, like the one and only time he really did something for money was Do I Hear a Waltz? And how often do we talk about Do I Hear a Waltz?
Yeah, in the retrospect. That's
anything else that you want to bring up?
As you're going into the rest of Sunday and then into the woods, being both the Pine shows.
Yeah.
But also being both of these shows that also, maybe I would say more so than others, where it is so much based on very small musical motifs. So like Into the Woods is a little bit easier to describe, but like the I wish interval where everything is built out of. There's similar ones, and that chapter I mentioned earlier outlines like 7 different kind of pitch patterns of like dreaming and working and light and those kind of things. But they're so really basic building blocks that he uses for both musicals. And I think both of them do something different than some of his other shows in that they are so, in a way, it's like a motive or a lead or something like this. Some people might say it's kind of simple, but putting it together means that it's actually a lot more difficult. And to make it, a 2-hour, 3-hour long 2-act musical where it's not repetitive and boring, in my opinion, but also that it's developing, but not altering the basic building block. And I think that that's something that also Sondheim is getting out of pointillism, is that, George is creating this, and it's the system to build something bigger out of little thing. And now I get to try to do that in this. I'm going to create something bigger out of just like, really, it's all like, let's look at a painting. What's going on? And I love the story that in Finishing the Hat, or Look, I Made a Hat, where Lapine and him were talking and they were going, nobody in the painting is looking at each other. Why are they all avoiding each other? What's going on? That their conclusion was like, well, who's missing? The artist. Who's the thing that makes it a whole? And so that taking all the little things and making it into a whole, I'm like, that's the big task. And this one and Into the Woods both, I think, do that very specifically with little musical bits.
Yeah, I mean, Sondheim had definitely experimented with like leitmotif throughout his career, but like Sunday and Into the Woods are by far the biggest examples of that, because it's consistently throughout that entire, or both of those scores, where it's like, there it comes again, there it is again, but here it is again in a different context, very intentionally using that leitmotif throughout those 2 scores.
And going to like musical modernism too, it's using musical modernist techniques more directly. So it's taking a motif or a lead motif and going, okay, what's the inversion of this and what would that do? So it's doing these mathematical algorithms to it, which is a very modernist technique in music, just to go, okay, we're going to invert it and then we're going to reverse it and then we're going to do it this way. And that's how it's going to work. So it's just through different functions rather than I felt like the function of this did this. It was emotion. No, it's like algorithm. A little bit.
It's just him at like the whiteboard, like furiously like making connections between different things, or the red string for the serial killer scene in a movie or something like that. Everything's connected. Chris, thank you so much for joining me here today. This has been a lot of fun to, break this down. If people wanted to find you, stay in contact with you, is there a way to do so online?
There is, although how much I actually talk about it is funny because I have to look up. So I am on Twitter, which means that I'm of a certain age. And my Twitter name is Christos M. Culp. So Christos MCULP. That is where I generally share and, learn about things in the world, but also like to engage with folks idea-wise. And then I lead somewhat of a public life. I have like a TED Talk that I've done and that kind of. So if you search my name and Queer Sex Ed, you'll find me on the TED Talk site.
What is the TED Talk on? What is the TED Talk on?
It's about queer sex ed for all. Not musical theater, but, my online presence.
I mean, people can't see this, but your background right now is Ellen Green from Little Shop of Horrors, which basically was my sex ed growing up. So
that is maybe that statement alone might generate its own like novel.
Something we're doing, I did not prep you for this whatsoever, and I apologize, but we play a song underneath the outro each week. What song do you want us to play out this week? It can be anything. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a Sondheim song.
Oh, golly. Would it be all right if I got back to you? Yeah. I'm thinking should be a Milton Babbitt song.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Great to speak with you and also get to engage as opposed to just hear you as my conscious in my head while I listen to the podcast.
I know. I'm not just a disembodied voice in your ears. I'm a real person. Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com, and you can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. This is an independent production. And you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere that you get podcasts from. You consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we get into Act 2 of Sunday in the Park with George, and I'm gonna admit, it's getting a little hot up here. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.